cloud. All right. So who are we? Why are we here? We're just a group of guys that we started talking after some of the latest Bible Project podcast episodes on the atonement and on sacrifice. And we just kind of started listening and going, there are things here that we wish that they would have either said differently or nuanced, or maybe there's context that might help people kind of bring frames to this that help them understand maybe the bigger picture of some of this stuff. So we're all Bible nerds, but each in our own way. So if you guys want to introduce yourself, my name is Joshua Sherman, and I'm just kind of hosting and recording here. And I guess I'll move on to Spencer.
Okay. I'm Spencer Owen. I don't, like he said, don't really have, any major credentials or anything. I'm just somebody who really, really loves reading Leviticus.
Nice.
That's a credential in and of itself, right?
Right.
Pretty much.
Yeah. Phil, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Really quickly, started listening to Bible Project and the whole Tim Mackie backlog. I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. He changed the way I read the Bible. Gave me freedom to just read it kind of on its own terms. To the point where we named our son Mackie after Tim Mackie, but we've got Scottish heritage as well, so that fits. Yeah, and at one point, after I'd been given freedom to read the Bible on its own terms, and I was kind of challenging stuff that I'd believed my whole life, someone asked me about, or just as a throwaway comment, just said, God poured out his wrath on Jesus. And I was like, hang on, let me just go back and check where that is in the Bible. And I couldn't find it. And 4 years later, I'd written about 40,000 words of notes as I explored and studied the atonement, and just consumed so many books and podcasts, and Leviticus has become one of my favorite things to read. I've halfway through, well, no, more than halfway, almost finished writing a book that's turned out to be on sacrifice. It started on atonement, but that was too big, so sacrifice is kind of where I'm at. But yeah, been studying atonement and sacrifice for like 4 or 5 years, not formally, just in my spare time.
Nice. Hi, I'm Troy Yurchak. Like the rest of us, just a Bible nerd. I love the Bible. Started questioning what I was handed from a modern Western evangelical perspective probably about 6 years ago, and ran into Tim Mackie's Exploring Our Strange Bible and fell in love with his perspective. Same thing with the Bible Project and their videos. I still share them with people because they explain things so well. So Tim Mackie, I'm a big fan. And then it comes to these last couple episodes, and kind of like Joshua said, there was some questions going, wait, that's not how I've seen it or seen it explained before. So anyways.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting too for me, because going through and listening to the second episode that they did in Sacrifice, I actually felt like it would have been much better served if they had done that one first. Because there are some big picture things that they mentioned that when you then get into the atonement and you have that big picture frame about sacrifice, it makes a lot more sense. That they picked up a lot more on talking about some of the communal aspect of and the feast of people coming and giving sacrifices, and then having a feast with people and with God, and that the sacrifices, gifts, and those kinds of things they got into in the second episode. But when we start talking about the atonement first, that stuff kind of was just mentioned either in passing or completely absent. And I feel like it kind of set us up for this conversation about atonement in a vacuum. And that was where we started to have conversations and say, maybe we should talk about some of this stuff with sacrifice and try to put it in a little more context. So they already did some of that, and some of that I think was really helpful and really good. But we just wanted to kind of talk through it and do that a little bit more. And for me, I think one of the first things when I've been digging into the atonement for a little while now too is just looking at it and saying, I feel like there's kind of 2 really big picture mistakes people can make when they do this. One of them is to come to the table with this is what I've always been taught about what Jesus did and how he accomplished it on the cross. And now I'm going to read that back into the Old Testament sacrifices, and that's going to tell me more about what Jesus did. And it's a circular thing, but it starts with, I already know what's going on in the Old Testament, and I don't really need to study it much because I already know. And I'm not saying that that's what, Tim Mackie was doing at all. But that's a framework that a lot of people do bring to it. And there are some points where I feel like it became a little bit obvious that there was some of that was going on in some of the stuff that Mackie was reading. So Who Shall Ascend the Mountain of the Lord? Really, really good. I really like Morales. So much of this is awesome. He does a really good job with the typology and connecting dots with biblical theology. But one of the things that I ran into that Tim Mackie mentioned just briefly in passing, I was talking about Noah. And so on page 60 here, returning to the word rest, this same root is at the heart of Lamech's hope as he names his son Noah. Noah fulfills his name by offering up ascension offerings from the summit of the Ararat Mount. Only when Yahweh smells the soothing aroma of atonement does his wrath relent, so that he covenants not to destroy the present cosmos by means of a deluge, although the problem of evil within the human heart remains. And so there's this idea here that what happens is God's mad, he brings the flood, Noah makes a sacrifice, and that makes everything better. And when you actually go into Genesis 8 and you read it, you have, first of all, wrath language is absent. God talks about, I regret that I've made humankind because of the wickedness and all of this stuff that's happened. But it's not necessarily wrath. But then you also have this nuance of God remembers Noah, right? He remembers Noah, and then when the waters recede, enough for Noah to get out, and then Noah makes the sacrifice. So the whole chronology of it is backwards if what you're trying to do is to say that this is wrath appeasement. And that's something that I think that Morales brings into it, partly because of his theological background that Tim Mackie was picking up on. And you can see different places where Mackie kind of follows that and places where he doesn't. And it's just interesting to kind of see where he leans on different things. But all that to say, I think if we read what we think we understand back into the Old Testament stuff, sometimes we can read things that aren't there. And I think that's a good example of that. The flip side would be looking at the Old Testament sacrifices as an equation and saying, okay, I need to solve for X. And what could possibly fit into X to bring this about? And Jesus is the ultimate X, so he fits in there. He takes care of the equation, right? And that really doesn't work either. Partly because I think what we see is that there's a sense in which Jesus fulfills all of the Old Testament sacrifices. The purpose that they were given for, he fulfills, right? And so to try to take any one of them and say he fulfills this every step of the way, the procedures are different, the steps are different, the categories are different, the aims of them are different. You can't really do that. And a good example of this is something where you just look at it and you say, okay, whenever we take communion, we take the bread and the wine, the body and the blood, however people understand the relationship between those two things, right? We're partaking of that because Jesus said to partake of it. In the Old Testament sacrifices, you never, ever partook of the blood, and you couldn't partake of the meat of a sacrifice whose blood was taken into the sanctuary. And in Hebrews, we see it talked about Jesus bringing his blood in and cleansing the heavenly tabernacle. Right? So you have this thing of if I try to make the Old Testament sacrifices the pattern this has to fit into, then I'm literally contradicting that pattern in Jesus. That's really weird and uncomfortable. And then you kind of go, maybe these are the types and shadows that point to the archetype, that point to Christ as the fulfillment. And if I understand the fulfillment, I can understand those types and shadows better. It's not that I want to read the fulfillment back into everything in every detail. That's the other end of this coin, right?
Right.
But we just have to be careful to not jump too quickly into one or the other, and to really kind of be thoughtful about the details we read in the Old Testament, not reading stuff into them that isn't there. But also recognizing that they are pointing to something that is bigger and greater and more fulfilled and three-dimensional than the types and shadows that they are. So that's kind of the way I would introduce this. Does anybody have anything they want to bring up with us?
So what you're saying is that Jesus fulfills all of the Old Testament Leviticus offerings and sacrifice, but those sacrifices are coming from an ancient context. It's not the other way around, where whatever Jesus has done dictated how God spoke to and related to the ancient Israelites. God entered into a relationship with the ancient Israelites in their culture, and from the culture that they were already practicing, God redefined how they were doing it and showed them what it looked like to be in a relationship with Yahweh God.
Yeah, I think the forms we
the
see
way
are more
that
that, but then like a lot of the
Yeah.
details of the redefinition are because of who Christ is and what he did.
Recognizing kind of like what you said about
I thought it might be helpful as well. I was just going to say it might be helpful at some point to look at other ancient sacrifices. Like I've got the Epic of Gilgamesh where with the flood story, and they offer a sacrifice.
Yeah.
Or is it Bel and the Dragon from the Daniel stories where they offer daily food offerings to their idol? So if we want to read those, we could do that. That might be really helpful for people to get an understanding of just what it looked like in an ancient culture.
Yeah. Do you have any of those available?
Yeah. So the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is from 2,500 BC or maybe later or earlier. So it's describing the flood narrative. And it says, I sent forth a raven and released it. The raven went off and saw the waters slither back. It eats, it scratches, it bobs, but does not circle back to me. I sacrificed. I offered a libation to the four corners of the world. I burned incense in front of the rising mountain. 7 and 7 cult vessels I put in place, and into the bowls I poured the oil of reeds, cedar, and myrtle. The gods smelled the savor. The gods smelled the sweet savor and collected like flies over a sacrifice. So the image is that there's been a flood and there's been no food available for the gods. And then, is it Utnapishtim? He's the only one and the only man to escape the flood, who's caused by the angry god, seeking to destroy all human life. He offers a sacrifice, and then the gods are so hungry that they gather like flies over this food that's being offered. I just find that really interesting that was how the ancients viewed sacrifice, but God, Yahweh God, is redefining what that practice that they were already doing is going to look like.
Yeah. I mean, you still have the food, but you don't have the sense that he needs it. Right.
Yep.
It's more the offering of it as a goodwill thing of, I want to be in relationship. I want to provide hospitality. I want to invite, God in. I want to give back in thanksgiving for what God has provided for me. I get back a part of it too. And so, and I feel like that whole thing of sacrifices as gifts and hospitality and food, it gets mentioned more in the second episode, which is good. But it didn't really register very much except for like the one food offering in the first episode. And so I was hoping, Phil, maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, the whole thing with ancient sacrifices and how people saw it and sacrifices, gifts and hospitality and all that, because I feel like understanding that frame as the big frame and then saying, when we talk about sin offerings and guilt offerings, whatever we're talking about, they fit within this overarching frame of understanding sacrifices. I feel like that provides context that we don't have when we think of atonement as the main thing. And then these other sacrifices are kind of just floating around,
Yeah. So, I haven't got notes, but
That's right.
like in that story from the Epic of Gilgamesh, how did an ancient know whether their sacrifice was accepted or not? So they would seek the god's favor, they would offer the sacrifice, and they would be hoping to win the battle, or they would be hoping for rain on their crops or whatever it was. How would they know if the god had heard and accepted their sacrifice? Well, they'd win the battle. They'd get rain. There just doesn't seem to be the idea of being defeated in battle and then feeling the need to offer a sacrifice to appease the angry god. It seems like it's the other way around. You want to seek the god's favor, You want the God to accept what you offer. And so you've got to offer something good. It's got to be worth it. And then you'll know if it's accepted because, yeah, you'll get the rain. You'll
Yeah.
win the battle.
Yeah.
Um,
But
we see a similar thing with the, go on.
oh, I was just gonna say it seems to me like even in the ancient sacrifices, and this is where for me it kind of reset my whole thinking when I started to read more about this, was even in the ancient and pagan sacrifices in first century Rome and like all of this, there's this whole range of what people were doing, and primarily what they were doing was we are bringing something to offer to this God, to this spirit that we worship, whoever it is, and we want to be in good relationship with them. So we're going to provide them with this gifts, this hospitality, this food. We want them to be part of our community. We want to be in their good graces. So there's much more of this sense of communion and community than there is appeasement in that larger frame. But then within that, you also have we think that the God is mad at us. What do we do? Or we want to, like you said, we're going into a battle. We want to make sure they're on our side. So let's appease them. It's almost more like a bribe. So there are those two kind of different things, but I feel like the overarching one is actually more that sense of communion and community.
I found it interesting how now, Phil, you might have comments on this, that in all of the other context, it seems that it's humans appealing to the gods, whereas the sacrificial system of Leviticus is God establishing like a request for a relationship, like he's requesting the relationship with humanity, whereas all the other ones is let's try to be in a good relationship with the gods. It's they don't answer until they swarm like flies. They don't answer until the battle's won. We're not actually in a relationship. We don't actually know until this point, whereas God, Yahweh is going, no, I want a relationship with you, and here's the meal I want to share with you. It's almost it's the inverse, and that may just be, I'm just looking at what we've shared just now, and what I'm thinking about in Leviticus. But I mean, there may be more context to that.
Yeah, so Yahweh God has already said that he will dwell in the midst of his people, and he's set up the whole system to reflect that. And now he's showing them, I've rescued you from Egypt. I'm going to dwell in your midst. This is what it's going to look like when you want to approach or draw near.
Yeah,
And that was really helpful, I thought, about Tim Mackey teasing out the drawing near, and how Leviticus sits between the other two books in the center. That's what it's going to look like now for his people to draw near to him. But he's already chosen to be in their midst.
Yep.
Well, I still see that like fellowship and relationship in the Noah Olah offering, because because what happens is he gives that ascension offering, and then right after that, the Lord smells the aroma, and then he says, never again will I curse the ground because of humans, and never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. So it's kind of like the thing that needed to be done, the cleansing has already happened. So it's not about averting, appeasing wrath, or avoiding that. It's already happened. But because after he smells the sacrifice, then it becomes like it's a free will relational restoration, saying, okay, because I hear that, I'm going to covenant with you.
Yeah, God leans in.
Well, and like for me, I look at that whole aspect, and it's like, is there a place where Noah was ever under the wrath of God in that scenario? And I kind of feel like there wasn't, because God specifically put him in the ark to save him. So like the whole line of the thing is like this, you are the one I'm going to bring through this, because you have been faithful, you have been righteous, you have sought me, and I'm bringing your family through. So like, you're not just the only guy, and you can't, like we need kids,
right.
Like, and so there's very much the sense of God bringing them through that, that paralleling the Exodus. It's like that the Exodus has already happened, the covenant, and now we have the parallel of at Sinai, like now we're making this covenant together. Now,
God
Noah makes
works
the sacrifice,
first.
and God leans in for the for the covenant. So,
Yeah.
yes, the relational thing I think is just it's huge, and then the cleansing and the purity that enables people to safely enter into God's presence is that other kind of really big theme, I think.
Did you want to talk about Passover on that
Yeah.
as well as?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As in Israel, a lot of people have said to me that Israel was under God's judgment as well as the Egyptians. And so that's why the Passover lamb needed to be offered as a substitution sacrifice. But again and again, when I read it, I notice that it's because it's definitely judgment on the Egyptian gods.
Yes.
Which it says in the Bible.
Mhm.
Pharaoh being
and
understood to be one of them by the people too.
Mhm.
So it's definitely judgment on
Yeah.
Pharaoh. Yeah.
Yep. And I often forgot that Pharaoh had slaughtered all of the firstborn Israelites.
Right.
And it's a judgment on Egypt as the epitome of the evil nation. And yeah, God is rescuing his people from that, and whatever that looks like with the angel of death. I feel like that language as well, like it's called the Lord. The Lord will kill the firstborn, and then the angel of death will kill the firstborn. Almost like the author is hesitant to attribute that death to God.
It's interesting too, because I feel like the way to kind of fit that into this substitutional frame, you have to be pretty narrow with it, right? Because it's like if you have multiple households that are small enough, they share it. So there isn't any kind of proportionality between how much lamb you need for each firstborn. And you also, have this weird thing of like, technically, all of the Israelites that weren't firstborns kind of didn't need that protection.
Yeah.
What do you do with that in the substitutional framework? Like it's something else is going on here.
Mhm.
And it's more about, you're right, it's more about the redemption of God's people than it is about the sense of like they're under wrath and the only way they can avoid judgment is to do this thing. It's more complicated. There's more nuance. There's more texture to the whole thing. And I feel like when we try to squish it into this pathway here,
Mhm.
we're not reading the text well.
Right.
It's the same thing as in the actual Levitical sacrifices, where the death of the Passover lamb is barely ritualized. I mean, if at all.
Mhm.
And what the text spends the time on is, here's what you do with the blood. Here's what you do with the meat. Here's how you cook the meat, and the whole process therein. And so it's more like the death is still there, and it's not irrelevant, but that's just really not the central point.
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel like we see. Oh, go ahead.
One of the things that I noticed is that when you look at the Passover, there is some correlations between that and Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah, is that there is this judgment coming and it's a call to come out. So the differentiation between who's an Israelite and who's an Egyptian at this moment is who participates in Passover.
Yes.
So you could have someone that is not blood related to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that is now an Israelite because they believed God. He just did, 9 great wonders, and this is the 10th. I'm going to trust that the 10th is going to go through. I'll put blood on my door. And
Yeah.
then you have Israelites who's been serving the gods of Egypt and are bitter at the work and everything else, and don't trust the narrative, don't trust the story, and they don't. And so it's not that the Israelites are under God's wrath. It's that here's how I'm defining Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Just as much as who's the righteous, those that leave with Lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those that are marked out by the blood of the Passover lamb, that's Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Well, and can you imagine, like, if the whole thing with the firstborn didn't happen after all of that, and you are one of those people that marked your door, like, you're marking yourself for death. Your neighbors are going to probably kill you.
Yep.
right? So there's definitely a risk involved. There's definitely trust involved. But that, I mean, we see that even with Caleb, the Kenizzite. Like he's not technically part of the 12 tribes, and yet he exits with the people, and he's one of the only two faithful spies that says we can take them.
Yep.
when they go and look at the promised land and see giants,
And later he's a leader of one of the tribes, as in he's part of it. So there's that. This is how we define who Israel is those that trust God and do what he says, in this instance.
Phil, is there more you want to talk about with the ancient sacrifices and all of that, or?
I think that's probably right for now. I think we've already talked about that, how it's primarily food.
Mm-hmm.
I actually thought that the second Bible Project podcast was really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
How they talked about the analogy of did they say bringing a bottle of wine, or but yeah, sharing the grain offering or the first fruits offering is I mean, food, everything that just can't get away from that, the bread of the presence, the grain offering, the oil, everything, the animals, it's all food, and most of the time it's eaten by a priest or the human, and often it's in the context of a feast.
Yes.
And I think the idea in the ancient mind is that they're sharing in the feast with their God.
Yes.
So actually, Lord of Spirits has helped a lot.
Yeah.
With the fathers talking about sacrifices a meal. Like Bible Project said, the word sacrifice doesn't show up until chapter 3 when they're talking about the peace offering. And I think the idea of that is that you share it with your family. Like when you make a pact between two families, you will share a peace offering. So it's like, and a marriage, I think they shared a peace offering as well. So it's like a celebration. It's a feast. You're sharing a meal with each other, and then part of it goes up to Yahweh God in the form of an ascension offering. But the idea is that you're sharing a meal with your God and with the people in your celebration feast. I think the Passover meal is exactly that. And it definitely points to Jesus and his Passover meal.
Well, that's exactly the reason why Paul gets so twisted about sharing Gentiles and Jews sharing table fellowship, is that to him is the gospel.
Yes.
And I mean, that's as clear as day in Ephesians 2, but it's all over like 1 Corinthians and a few other places where he talks about like it's not just like this mystical thing out there, like completely all about symbolism. It's practical. About how by sitting down and taking communion, and by having this kind of love feast, and how you treat the people in terms of like where you sit them, and
whether you're discerning the body or not is how he puts it. Yeah.
Exactly. It's like that is how you demonstrate your participation in Israel.
Yes. I think that because we're talking about what they went into greater detail in the second episode, which was really helpful. I really wish that would have been kept in mind in the first episode, because I think it would have given a little bit more orientation to some of the things, like Joshua, like how you mentioned that there was times that he was leaning one direction and then he would swap to the other one, and then he'd lean back, and it was really confusing and disorienting. But if you have this, all right, base level sacrifice is a meal that is shared between God's people and God, then the rest of it orients around that, and it makes it a lot easier to navigate all the different sacrifices. And then you get to see, okay, this one's not actually a meal. There's when that stands out, now you see, okay, why is this one different? All the other ones have been meals. Why is this one different? And I think that would have been really helpful to start there. Like you said, start with the second episode and then the first.
And I would actually recommend people kind of listen to them in that order for that reason.
When you read through Leviticus, as I've done several times, you get to chapter 16 where it describes Day of Atonement and the language changes massively. Like you wouldn't notice it unless you get pretty familiar, unless you have this special relationship with Leviticus. But everything changes. Like it's different. Even to the point of putting both hands on the animal, but like as N.T. Wright says, it's the only animal that doesn't die. It specifically does not die. It's sent out.
And the only one that has sins.
We're supposed to read it as different.
Yep.
Well, and that
Correct.
was one of the things I appreciated with that Tim brought out, is like the hand laying can't really be a transfer of sin. And that's such a common way to look at it. But like, if you think about it, I'm bringing a blameless gift to God, and then I'm going to transfer sin to it and be like, here's my blameless gift that's been tainted with sin. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. And so there has to be something else going on there, right?
It would be unthinkable. Like, it would be an abominable act to take that goat with all of the sins placed on it and put it on God's altar and offer it up to God. Like you couldn't imagine doing that.
Yeah. Well, the guy who takes
and I think you need to have it.
Go ahead, Phil.
Yes, I think about viewing what the other sacrifices and offerings do. And then you read about atonement and that goat. And then, I think what you're going to say is that the wash his clothes before he can come back into the camp. Like, he's considered unclean.
Yep.
Just by touching it.
Which is just like, like how in the world could that possibly go into the sanctuary? It can't. And that's part of the point, you know? So the other thing I think that's helpful, and this is something that I thought was interesting that they didn't bring up, is when they're talking about the korban and trying to define what that is. It's like the thing you bring near that you bring near. I think it was kind of how they said it. Or when you bring near the thing brought near, maybe something like that. When that is translated into Greek for the Septuagint, the translators that were doing it, that were Jewish, that understood all of these things, translated as doron. They translated as gift. It's like, so when you bring your gift to the altar, like, like that brings so much clarity to me. And yet it was absent from that conversation. This is just another kind of thing of, do we want to put all of, every bit of this is how we understand it in that one word? Probably not, but it gives so much clarity to include that and to recognize that that's a huge part of the range of meaning we're dealing with here.
I think it's really important to remember that I think one of the main reasons for Leviticus is to describe what that gift should be, and which is blameless or unblemished.
And it's not completely alien to.
I think that is super important.
Yeah, it's not completely alien to our practices today. Like at a 15-year anniversary, you get crystal. There's certain gifts at certain times, right? What's your 25th anniversary is silver. What's your your 50th anniversary is gold. We have these rules when it comes to gift giving that is reiterating a long-term relationship. And I think that it's not the only way to see what's going on in Leviticus, but it is a very helpful way to see what is going on in Leviticus. Like, this is a housewarming gift for the presence of God. This is what he expects,
incense, right? Yes. It's like I'm putting up incense and barbecue. Come on over, like
come have a meal with me.
Yeah.
And to me, that just gets sharpened when we consider that the majority of these sacrifices that are prescribed in Leviticus for sins, for actual sins, are for unintentional sins. I mean, almost exclusively. And so, like, that goes against this whole transactional. Okay, I stole from somebody, therefore I have to go, give a goat or something like that. But it also demonstrates that, like, that the entire point of that is not to balance an equation necessarily. Right. The whole point of that is you are in someone else's house, you are in someone else's space, and you have knocked over a vase, in their living room. you have to do something to make it better, because or else you're going to have a relational disconnect here. And what do you do when your kid knocks it over? Well, that's a different kind of thing. Like it's a whole different, it's all about that relational dwelling among. That's the core central foundation of it all.
Yeah, I think one thing that I wished were brought out a little bit more was that it's not only moral failure, or it's not that you've wronged God. You could just have given birth and you still need to offer the sin offering. Or you could have just buried your parent and touched their body, or rescued someone who's just had a heart attack in a field and touched their dead body. Or something that I've been chatting with people recently that has affected me. Like, you could give birth to a stillborn baby. And it's
that a
so
sin?
hurtful to tell someone that. Exactly.
Yeah.
It's so hurtful to tell someone that that's a sin, that you've broken a relationship or you've wronged someone. I think the sin offering is to repair damage, and it's to heal being unclean. Yes, but I think we need to redefine what it means to be unclean.
Unclean is not a moral thing. It is definitely it's a more ritual thing. I mean, there are things in that type of sacrifice where it's talking about like afterbirth or touching death or all of those things. It's not necessarily, there's no way to read it as this, there's something corrupted about you. That's a twist on it.
It's the thing of the man born blind, right? Did he sin or did his parents sin? No. Like, this was done so that God's glory could be manifest here. And so, I think maybe the way to look at it is that moral failing does cause impurity, but there's a lot of impurity that happens without moral failing.
Right.
And that, I think, was the thing that I really felt uncomfortable with in the first episode, was that the moment they started to talk about atonement, while they did get into later, what are we talking about, cleansing? Are we talking about ransom? What are these different things? There was a moment when Tim said something about, like, the people have wronged Yahweh in some way. And that was the first example that came to mind. And it's like, well, that is a subset of this whole thing. The whole thing is about having the purity to be able to safely enter in. And there's so much about the things that deal with purity that are not about moral failing, but then there are some that are. And so we have a class of things to deal with that too.
Kind of like the whole and unwhole, as if that sacrifice specifically is, it's a declaration of, you are now whole and welcome back. I mean, because you look at how we would deal with that today, and I don't mean to be crude, but there's certain times where you abstain in consummating a marriage for that very reason, right? And when that's over, there's the welcoming back. And I think that's looking at it the wrong way. Like, I need to atone for something in the way that we've been understanding it. I think that's wrong, when we could be looking at it as, no, this is, I get to share a meal again. I get that intimacy again. I'm being declared whole again, versus there's something wrong with birth. There's something wrong with bearing my father. There's something wrong. That's anyways. Sorry.
Well, and the clearest example of that, of course, is childbirth. And that's where my tension, my discomfort with the whole substitution identification, I press my hands on the animal, therefore it now is me, and so it dies in some way, and I know Tim kind of struggled to really articulate that well, but the problem is, like, if you just went through childbirth, then you have to then go give a chata, which is that sin offering, purification offering. There is no sense in which, like you said, like, someone has wronged God by doing that, but they still have to do that. And so how would they be identifying in any way with the animal? Like, it doesn't make sense to be able to do that in this, like, hyper moralized framework. It's just it's all about ritual impurity. And as you were talking, Phil, I almost jumped in, was like, I don't know if anyone's ever read Matthew Thiessen's Jesus and the Forces of Death. Excellent book. have to read it.
Mhm.
It basically, well, for one, gives a nice little chapter length summary of Jacob Milgram, which is worth the price of admission on that alone, because all these like categories of ritual impurity versus moral impurity and everything else, and that kind of quadrant of holy, common, clean, unclean, all those kind of things. Like, it's really, really important, absolutely critical for understanding Leviticus. And so the Matthew Thiessen's book is really good just to simply have that, background alone. But then beyond that, he starts talking about how Jesus's goal was not to upend and take away the whole ritual purity system, or even for that matter, the food and dietary regulations. The whole goal was to just deal with the root problem, to deal with the forces of death that were causing the ritual impurity that made childbirth required, the chata and then the other things like that. And that's why it's really, really important to understand that that's the background in which Jesus comes in, and that's the context in which his sacrifice makes sense and his ministry makes sense.
Definitely touching on his ministry, him being able to touch a leper, or him being able to interact and make him, according to the rules, make himself unclean, is that, it sounds like what you're talking about, him dealing with the forces that are making someone ritually unclean, dealing with the very root problem of it. That's amazing. And then that gets projected into what Peter goes through on the roof with, look, do not call unclean what I have made clean.
There's a whole chapter on Acts 10 in that book.
Oh, awesome.
Yes. Oh, yeah, I need to read that book. So a couple of connections there. So thinking about the holiest things that were most consecrated, like when something touched them, those things were actually made holy, right?
But you had to destroy them now.
Yeah. But like, I feel like there's a picture there, even like a type there of like, Jesus is the holiest thing. And so when he doesn't become unclean, he makes them clean. Right. And so you have that kind of connection there. You also have this sense of with Father Stephen DeYoung's dissertation on 1 John 2:2, the cleansing not only for our sins but for the sins of the world, is how people usually think of it, and the way that he kind of rephrases that, because the sins of the world isn't really in the Greek, is not only for our sins but for the whole world, and saying like there's a cosmic cleansing that actually Christ accomplishes in the heavenly tabernacle when he takes his blood in as our great high priest, that actually makes, like, transforms creation in some way. And I think that's like a really great way to understand what's going on in Acts, where you look at it and you say, like, when Peter starts talking to people and he's like, so this thing happened with the Gentiles. Like, in his head, he has all of this Leviticus, all of this purity stuff in his head, where it's like, people touch the ark, Uzzah touches the ark, he dies, right? Yep. You have the sons of Levi, that offer the strange fire.
Sons of Aaron.
Sons of Aaron. Yeah, sons of Levi are a different kind of thing. But the sons of Aaron, they offer strange fire, and they they die. Like, this is a big deal. The sacred space is a big deal, and now suddenly you have the Holy Spirit indwelling Gentiles who eat bacon.
Didn't die.
And they didn't die. Like, this is a complete reframe of the entire way that Israel has understood how the world and sacred space works. And I think it helps us to frame, like, what happened with the atonement. It has to be around cleansing somehow, because how else does this work?
Yeah.
So that was, go ahead, Phil.
Sorry, what?
Oh, sorry. I thought you were going to talk, but
No.
That was one thing that I was kindly struggling with with Tim Mackey, was how he was explaining atonement, and that actual word kippur. Yeah. And I know, like, I believe it's in the sacrifice, or the I think it's in the sacrifice, like, short little 5-minute video. He talks about it as a covering, and that is something that I've kind of raised an eyebrow at before, because even though that is in the word, that's not that's not what most of the scholarship is pointing now. It's mostly saying, like, it's usually more like a wiping away or a wiping off or something like that, rather than like covering over. It's more like that, like Milgram's ritual detergent rather than like a ritual blanket, so to speak.
It's not
And-
sweeping it under the rug. It's actually removing the dirt.
Exactly. It's actually removing it, which is, again, part of that, what Jesus is doing, actually removing the problem. But like when he started talking about ransom being in there, and I mean, I want to be clear, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I've done a lot of reading of Hebrew scholarship and Hebrew language scholarship. And as clearly as I can tell, yes, ransom is in the sense of the word, but like there was one thing he was at one point he mentioned, like the word means both things and it's all there. I forget exactly how he said it, but it was essentially, I got the impression that he was essentially saying like there's ransom and there's cleansing, and they're both packaged, they're both like intertwined like this, and they're always together. You see one, you see the other. I don't think that's the way it works, honestly. Partly because like there are moments like in Exodus 30, I believe it is, where there's an atonement price that's paid. It's just a certain number of shekels. It's like I have a hard time seeing where cleansing fits into that. Like that seems clearly like a ransom price. And then there's other moments, like in the sacrificial context, where if ransom is there, it is buried deep. Like it's not in there at all. Like in any kind of explicit sense. And so I want to be really, really careful and cautious that we don't just barrel through and say, okay, it's a ransom. And again, I'm not saying it's not there. It is, but it just has to be careful, because for meanings of words, always context and usage determines meaning. And I would just want to figure out where in the description of the Levitical sacrifices is there a sense that you are ransoming your life back.
I think we see that more with the Passover. Right.
Yes.
And when we start bringing ransom language into that, the closest you get to any kind of actual compensatory ransom is what you were talking about, whereas ransoming the firstborn back much later in the process. But like you have this talk of being ransomed from Egypt, and there's no sense of payment. It's a smackdown. It's like the ransom.
Don't touch my kids.
Like, Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt lose. That's the ransom, And I think we have that dynamic too when we look at what Jesus accomplished on the cross and resurrection and ascension. Is you definitely have a sense of like the conquering of the powers and the principalities, and like it's a victory, right? That may not be all of the meaning of it, but to talk about that in ransom terms and think of it as an exchange, I think kind of confuses the categories when you draw the parallels with the Exodus, and you go like, this is a deliverance of people, and that's how they were set free from slavery, because ransom could mean that. And Jesus doing the same thing, but it's literally like, and now people are going to be set free from all of the gods of the nations, because they're going to see that offering them worship is bad and doesn't need to be done. They don't need to fear them anymore. And you don't need to have the other aspect that Paul gets after people about, which is, don't have fellowship with demons. Like, don't offer them sacrifices, because that's what you're doing. And somehow we see that and we reread that and we go, oh, sacrifices. Oh, communion and fellowship. That's neat. And we don't carry it over to how we understand what sacrifices are in our context with God, who is the creator. Like, it just, anyway.
Well, and
yes, if you do,
go ahead, Phil.
If you do a word search for how ransom is used in the Bible, it's primarily used as rescue language. And God is the one doing the ransoming. God ransoms his people from Egypt, and in the Psalms and all over the Old Testament, it's always rescue, Exodus language.
I thought it also was applied between Abraham and his rescue of Lot right before he meets Melchizedek. Now, I tried to find it, but I wasn't able to find it in time. But I think
in family, you ransom.
Yep. And that ransom
within a family, you rescue family members. Yes.
Yeah. So that
I've got to look for it.
Well, and I think you also hear that ransom language in the context of like slavery and servitude, which I think is very applicable to Egypt and the rescue there too, and that connects directly to Paul in Colossians when he says like you've been transferred from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of the beloved Son. It's that kind of transfer of ownership. Just like in the Passover, you have, you know, the Israelites who after centuries are probably not all that separate from the Egyptians. I mean, let's not forget that Joseph's two sons were half Egyptian anyway. So anyway, so you have the Israelites that are kind of bought out of that context, and so that purchase price to kind of transfer ownership from one domain to another, like that's the only way that I can kind of see ransom in the sacrificial context, particularly when it comes to that like pressing on of hands, is that I mean honestly, like unlike Mackie, I really don't see that as an identification, like this is now me, for a whole bunch of reasons. But I see it more as like a dedication, like this is now, and this goes back to Milgram's categories of common versus holy. So it's more like this animal is blameless, but that doesn't in and of itself make it holy, because again, it's not about like moral purity here. So the animal is blameless, but it's still common. By pressing the hands on, and then I transfer it from that realm of common and the world where sin and death reign and rule, and I transfer it to the realm of the holy, where it now gets dedicated for a certain specific service to Yahweh, and that's what makes it acceptable, not this kind of substitution, vicarious identification process, but more like simply the idea that like now its ownership, so to speak, has been transferred.
And that fits with,
there is identification. This is the gift that I'm bringing.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And that's what you also see in the use of Paul when he's talking to Timothy about laying out of hands by both himself and the leadership, is that it was a gift we gave you and you need to use it properly. So, I mean, you think of it from that perspective, is that anywhere else it's laying out of hands, it is this dedication to a specific service, right? Where Paul is commissioned, they lay hands on him. Everywhere else, that's what it's used for. So why is this this animal is now me, and it gets to go into the Holy of Holies and die on my behalf? It doesn't seem to fit with the entire narrative, where you've got earlier in the story Jacob laying his hands on Joseph's sons, right? That's they're yes, he's saying they're my sons now, but the point comes down to is still they're being set apart for a specific service. That's different than they are now me.
Yeah, you see the exact same language when the priests are dedicated. The hands are laid on. There's even blood applied to the earlobes. It's the same language. They're becoming set apart for a holy purpose. They're now becoming holy priests, a little bit extra holy.
and you even get
but it's the same language.
You even get a little bit of that with the sprinkling of the blood on the people with the covenant, which is the only time it's sprinkled on people, right? As like that sense of like you're part of the covenant, you're part of a nation of priests, but then there's still these priests that are moving even closer in that sacred space and having roles of being the go-between to foster that good relationship. And it gets interesting too, because this frame of the sacrifice and gifts and relationship carries really well into the New Testament when you start having Paul talking about grace and faith and all of that. The framework of that in the first century with patronage was, that you couldn't earn a grace gift from a patron. They are of a higher status than you, right? There's nothing you can do to earn that. But if they choose to give that gift to you of their patronage, you're expected to reciprocate. You're expected to reciprocate with faith, with pistis, with allegiance, with loyalty, right?
Faithfulness.
And so there are things that you will do as part of that relationship to demonstrate that you want to be in that relationship, and back and forth it goes. To not reciprocate that gift is to signal that you don't want the relationship.
Yes.
Right? So again, it's crazy to me once you start to frame the sacrifice in this way and see it that way, how well that carries forward into how we talk about the relationship that we have with God through Christ, and then the Christ gift that we are given. and then the reciprocation of that with pistis, with faith, faithfulness, loyalty, allegiance. All of those words are kind of crammed into the meaning of that, and you have to look at the context again, like you were saying, Spencer, to figure out like what are we talking about here. We're talking about a king, we're talking about God. There's probably a lot of a loyalty and allegiance built into that, because that's what you're supposed to give to someone in that position.
In light of the mercies of God, let us present ourselves as living sacrifices.
Yes.
Yep. And that's
What does that mean if it's all about death?
Exactly.
Yes.
Yep.
Living sacrifices.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the, I mean, I could just hear certainly the tension in John's voice, and the kind of like difficulty in Tim's voice with trying to like explain, well, if there's this identification thing, then why does the animal die? Because it's blameless. And I think it's just because like they're using the wrong frame for the entire process. Like the whole goal of those sacrifices is to dedicate the whole animal, the entire being, the nefesh, the soul, the whole life, which includes, because like in the case of, I mean, and every sacrifice is a little bit different, but I'll just, just focusing on the chata, which is that like purification offering. The blood has certain things done to it. Some of it gets poured out on the altar, or at the base of the altar. Some of it sometimes gets taken into the Holy of Holies. And then you have the flesh, which sometimes gets eaten by the priest and sometimes gets burned up on the altar. And then you have the inward parts, or the offal, OFFAL, is so that's like the kidney, the liver, and then the fat kind of like around it. That all gets burned up on the altar as a kind of symbolic communion, as a symbolic table fellowship with God. And that thing is what is called the sweet savor, or the pleasing aroma. And then you have like the flesh that gets in some cases, I'm not entirely certain off the top of my head if or not the flesh, the hide, sorry. I'm not entirely certain if the chata hide gets given to the Levites or not. I know it does in the case of the olah. So that gets given to the Levites to kind of care for them. And then the rest gets burned off in a ceremonially clean place outside the camp. And I just don't see how that identification works at every single point of that whole process. So the whole point is
if you want to make it an equation, how does it work?
Yeah, exactly. Like everything about the animal, the inward parts, the blood that carries the life, the refuse, everything gets offered as a gift, as a food offering, in explicitly in some cases. And how does that work with like this requirement for death? Well, I mean, death is there obviously because that's the only way to get to the rest of it.
Right.
But it doesn't make sense in this living sacrifices context that Paul talks about. So it makes much more sense if you kind of shift the whole frame and say, this is about gift giving. This is about communion. This is about fellowship. This is about how God makes a way, how a holy God makes a way to purify so that he can dwell in the midst of an unholy people.
And death is an expression of a dedicated life.
Yes.
So when you have a dedicated life, that also is doing the same thing in a lot of ways. One of the other things that's kind of interesting to me, I was thinking about this earlier, was just like, we get really hung up on the fact that there are animals that are killed in the sacrifices. Really hung up, right? And yet, like
Super Bowl Sunday.
Most of the people that get hung up on that have no problem with the way that we butcher meat in the modern world, or if they do, they just ignore it, right? And so for me, like I started thinking about it, it's like, this is how a lot of the societies worked, is that the temple would do this, they had the meat, they would do all these things, and then it went to the marketplace, or then it went to the family that brought it, and there was a feast. Like this was kind of like butcher shop plus ritual, right? And if you think about it that way, then the killing actually isn't about like this thing needs to die. There's no ritualization of that. That's very quick. Usually it's the offerer that does it and not the priests, which makes it kind of odd to think ritual and think like not priest doing it.
If it's about executing God's justice, why doesn't God execute God's justice? Why does a sinner like it doesn't make sense?
Well, and why doesn't and like, if it's about wrath, then why doesn't the priest ritually act that out and like torture the animal?
Yeah.
Or
And the priest
there's
as the
all of those
representative
kinds of
of
things
God.
that don't happen. And yeah, the priest is, you're right. They're the representative of both sides. And so to me, it's like, what's weird to us is literally just, you made that killing public and we're uncomfortable with that because of how we like to have our meat butchered in the silence over here. And then it's the blood manipulation that weirds people out, right? And that's the part I think that maybe is the hardest for us to understand. But
that's the point. That's like, if there is, I mean, I will appreciate that Mackie and, you know, and he's following Morales and several others, you know, but like, I appreciate that they get that that's the point, that the blood equals life.
Yes.
And then it's like this application of pure, powerful life onto a tainted, contaminated space that acts as this ritual detergent that cleanses that sacred space and then kind of resets everything so that God can continue living in the midst of the people. I do appreciate that. I just felt like that little 2-minute window there in the podcast was where they really struggled to articulate, why death? Why isn't it even there? And I think it was because they were kind of still framing it with that, like, well, humans suck. Humans have created this world that, you know, lives in death, swims in death, and it was unconvincing for me.
One of the things I was thinking about earlier too was just, it seems to me like when we look at Hebrews, you know, it talks about the fact that like the blood of bulls and goats can't actually take away, and can't cleanse, right? And yet that's what they're supposed to do in the Levitical sacrifices. So you look at that and you kind of go, okay, like, are you saying that didn't work at all and it wasn't designed to work? What are you even doing? And I think maybe the way this works, and this is something I'm still kind of working out, but when we partake of communion, we are partaking of bread and wine. We're partaking of the body and blood. Again, people view those relationship between those things different ways. Okay. But like, we're remembering Christ's death. We're connecting into that sacrifice, right? And that is something that God has provided for us to nourish us spiritually in some way. There's a connection of that back to that. Yes. And I feel like maybe what's happening with the Levitical sacrifices, and we were talking about this back and forth, and this is why I'm bold enough to even say it, as it's speculative in my mind still, but I feel like the Old Testament sacrifices work because they are a low resolution ritual participation in the death of Christ.
Yes.
And that it's not that the blood of the animal actually brings life to death, because that animal had to die. So it's not the conquering of life over death, even though it kind of is with the blood. The animal's still dead, right? But with Christ, it is, because he conquered death. And so when you're connected into that ritually through all of this, then it is a conquering of death through the blood, through the life, because you're connected into the victory of God over the powers of sin, death, and demons. Like, that's it. You know, that in my head makes sense, that it's both ways connecting into that central core event.
Yes. Archetype.
We have.
Oh, go ahead.
It's been helpful for me to redefine or rethink about what God wants. God doesn't require a death. The Leviticus, I think, is pretty clear that what God wants is the lifeblood of the animal is acceptable to God. We can't say that God requires a death. We can say that God is showing and teaching that he wants a blameless life. And that's exactly what Jesus does. He doesn't give God a death that is required. He gives God the blameless life. And that life can be, I don't want to talk about transference, but Jesus' life is acceptable on behalf of humanity.
Well, when I read Isaiah 53, that's exactly how that suffering servant language gets talked about, because it says, like in verse 12, that he's a suffering, that he bears the sin of many, and that he pours out his nefesh unto death. So that whole context, like bearing the sin of many, I mean, as Tim very good pointed out, that's not the sacrificial animal. because that animal never bore sins. It was just the Azazel goat and the priest. Those are the only two figures that are sin bearers. And so it's like, which of those two is Jesus acting as, or as you put it, Joshua, that kind of low resolution, is that Isaiah 53 a low resolution image of? And it's more like that consecrated priest who offers his whole life as living sacrifice of faithful and righteous service, which is exactly how, Peter talks about the whole community of believers. You are a royal priesthood.
Yes.
And so, I mean, there are definitely sacrificial elements in that Isaiah 53 picture of Jesus' sacrifice, but it's just, it's not there as the sin bearer.
Well, and I think if we're going to talk about the sin bearer, then you get into that Day of Atonement language and you start having conversations about, is it the scapegoat or the goat for Azazel, and what does that mean? And and so maybe the closest you could come, if you want to get into that, is Jesus bearing the sins of humanity into Hades, and then being like, all this stuff that like, it's like the Ring of Power, like all this stuff that you thought was controlling everything and was so valuable, it's worthless, and here you go. I feel like that's the closest you get to a sin-bearing idea in the scriptures that Jesus fits, if you think of him as both goats, right? If you focus on the priest, which obviously he is too, like there's all of these different layers to that. But in that case, it's literally bearing the sins away into the wilderness, into the archetypal wilderness of death. And then there they are. And even if you want to talk about ransom language, I could almost go there and say something like, Jesus bore the sins, the wages of sins is death. He goes in and he says, here's all the sins that you brought in the world.
To my people's
you charged to my people. I'm going to drop them at your doorstep in exchange for their life.
Yep. And the free gift of God is eternal life.
You could maybe go there too. I think that may be the closest we get to any kind of a ransom that gets paid at all, but it's literally paid in worthless currency.
Yes. You can have this back.
Yeah. So I don't know, but that's like the closest thing I see when I start to connect those dots. Again, some of that is just kind of like, this is kind of cool, and maybe it makes sense, but maybe it's not the primary metaphor we're working with here, right? So,
well, and just one last thought real quick for me. Mako Nagasawa, I don't know if any of you are familiar with his stuff, but like the AnastasisCenter.org is a treasure trove of resources. And I mean, he talks about it a lot as like a medical substitution, sort of like a dialysis machine of like, taking in the impurity, and then the holiness swallowing up the death and then giving back life. And I think that's, that image has really stuck with me as like a really good one for understanding the Levitical sacrifices. Like if we keep focusing on the death, like we miss the point. The whole point of the Levitical sacrifices is not to kill something, but to give back life. Partly by God continuing to dwell, mostly by God continuing to dwell among the people. But then also like there's the extra, giving back of life of providing for the Levites who aren't who are limited in their ability to be able to hold land and have livestock and stuff like that.
It's supposed to be anyways.
Providing for the people, providing for the poor among the people, providing, this is a gracious provision and giving back life. And I just want to be really, really clear that when we focus so much on, it has to die, the animal has to die, we run a real risk of missing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think when we look at the atonement, really what we're seeing primarily with Christ having to die was, if you're going to conquer death, you kind of have to die, but is that what's needed to accomplish the other parts of what's going on? That's where I think there's an equation and this kind of mashing together of things that I think maybe has been mashed together a bit hastily, thinking that now we have a mechanism that can explain everything. And
it's an over explanation that leads you to error. I think that's there's mystery in it. It's not, you can't nail it down. And I think that's how it's supposed to be. And over explaining it always is going to lead to error. And if that's what's happening, is that, oh, wait, now we've got the equation, we've balanced the equation, we've solved for X. If we're looking at it that way, we're going to get the X we solve for is going to be an error, because that's not how it was intended anyways. It's a relational thing. And, any of us that are married, it doesn't work that way when you're trying to interact with your wife if it's mathematical. Like you can't take your notebook in there and go, all right, this is what I do first. I turn down the lights. The next thing I put on very white, whatever it is. That's
and
not
then you
going to
get
work.
does not compute.
Exactly. So if it's all relational, why are we trying to force it into an equation that because I've harmed God in some way by burying my father, by having a child, by actually sinning accidentally or intentionally, why are we forcing that all into this equation? It shouldn't be an equation. It should be, how is this relationship going to continue where the presence of God burns away death? Now you're attached to death. We've got to deal with that because that's going to kill you in my presence. How do we continue the relationship? That's the thing I think is like you said, I think we so focused on the death part because it may be the gruesome part, but it's like, that'd be like having a football party or your favorite sporting event, having a whole slew of barbecue and everybody's freaking out about how many pigs died today. Nobody cares. It's the meal, it's the relationship, it's the enjoyment together. So
and yeah, go ahead, Phil.
No, I didn't have anything.
Okay. There's just a little lag, so we're like, we keep going, oh, he's okay. So one of the other kind of things with this, and we talked about this as well as we were kind of preparing this, was one of the things that made me really uncomfortable in that episode, the first episode on atonement, was when Tim brought up Moses as an example of this kind of vicarious substitutional atonement kind of thing. And like, I kind of get it, because Moses uses the word at one point, perhaps I can atone. Like, let me go try to make atonement, right? But again, within this frame, it's like, it doesn't really fit very well, because and Tim even talks about this. It's like, God will take the blameless life of somebody in exchange for someone else. And then he kind of does that with Moses, even though he doesn't take his life. And like, for me, like, the big thing is like, he didn't take his life. So is that what we're talking about? It felt like it was discussing this thing and getting into Exodus. That's not really the story Exodus is telling. Right. So Troy, you were looking at that. Do you want to talk about that, or do you want me to ramble on?
No, that's fine. So I went back because I actually wanted to read that part of the story and go, all right. Obviously my memory is not perfect. So let me look at it and how does it progress? And it's, Moses is on top of the mountain. He's getting the 10 commandments. God knows what's going on with the golden calf. He tells Moses, these evil people, I'm going to destroy them. And God says, don't do this. You brought them out of Egypt with such a strong hand.
Yeah, Moses says,
and if you're going to do that, might as well destroy me. He goes, okay, I've forgiven the people. I won't destroy them. And then Moses goes down, sees what's going on, gets angry, and then calls everybody to put on their swords that's with Yahweh and slaughters people. So there's still a death. Like, it may not be an animal death, but there's death. And then after that, Moses says, you've done a grave sin. And God's response is, I've stayed my hand, but those that were accomplices or a part of this, I will take judgment on. So it's like, that's not the best example of this mediator that, it doesn't require death. Look, Moses said it, God said he forgave him. No, that still happened. Something happened, so I just, for me, it was like, that's not the right, if you're trying to make that argument that God will accept someone standing in the gap, I would love to hear that argument made. I think everybody would. But that's not the right story to draw from if you're going to
The
try.
thing is that the animal doesn't make atonement. It's God makes atonement, or the priest
Yes.
makes atonement. So you can't read atonement into the animal doing anything.
Right.
If anything, the animal is the acceptable offering.
Mhm.
And then as a response, although I don't want to say as a response, atonement is offered to the person or the place or the camp or the whole nation, whatever it is.
And a lot of it is to objects. So how do you deal with that when you're talking about moral failing, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, and if it's the priest, if it's God, the priest acting in the place of God, right? And if it's God who's actually one doing the atonement, how does it seems like God is atoning for, in a lot of cases, he's atoning for inanimate objects. That is clearly cleansing, right? It's also kind of weird to talk about God atoning himself. Like, I don't know. It's like either God is the actor or God is the one being atoned, right? And propitiation would propose that he's the one that receiving atonement, not the one doing it. And maybe you could have an argument for both and I think that's where a lot of people go with penal substitutionary atonement, is that it's, God in Christ offering the sacrifice to the Father and the Father accepting that, and that's the wrath appeasement. But again, the equation that we see, and I don't want to use equation, the examples that we see in Leviticus don't really fit that.
Well, and neither does the Moses situation. That you were talking about. I mean, I know in some of our conversations a little bit before this, like it seems to me like it's a thing where, I mean, exactly what you said, Phil. God's the one doing this. Like, this is not the people manipulating God into, like, or forcing him into, like, he has to make atonement because a death has occurred now. Like, the equation is now balanced. Come on, let's go.
That's
like
a pagan view of it.
It is.
Yes.
Right. It is very much like God is going to do what God's going to do. And he has made a way, accommodated the worldview of his people to give them this atoning, to give them that's what it says in Leviticus 17. I have given you, the blood as a way to make atonement, because the life is in the blood. But then there are other times, like with Moses, where Moses says, perhaps I can make atonement. And God says, okay, I will not wipe out the whole people, but I am going to take care of the people who have sinned. There are still consequences for sin, which is very much that Exodus 34:6-7, loyal love, compassionate, gracious, merciful, grace for thousands of generations, and also will not clear the guilty. So I think I want to make sure that we leave room for the sovereignty of God to kind of do whatever he needs to do, which I know sounds really weird coming from someone who's not really into like this PSA framework. But the problem is that the whole PSA framework makes it this equation to be balanced.
Yeah.
And that feels to me like almost like a magic system of manipulation of God. And it really just needs to be, no, God will do whatever needs to be done to make restorative justice happen. If that means people or animals die, that's what that means. And if that means that people or animals are cleared and he just wipes the slate clean and remembers it no more and removes it as far as the east is from the west, then that's what that means. But that's God's prerogative, and he gets to decide when and how he forgives.
Yes.
Yep.
And I think we see a lot of examples where, like, that Moses one is like a weird example, both for the sense of the mediator that's successful because it's like partial success.
Yeah.
Right? And also a really weird one for the substitutionary thing, where it's like, if the whole idea is the, he can atone and then there isn't a punishment for people, that's clearly not what happened in that story.
No.
But we do have a lot of other examples in scripture of God, kind of, he's looking for someone to stand in the gap for the people and to advocate for them on behalf, to be a mediator right? You have Abraham with Sodom and Gomorrah. You
Yes.
have, Hezekiah, calling out to God and basically saying like, hey, like, I'm on my deathbed and like,
I've been faithful.
yeah, like, please. And God's saying, okay, I'm going to give you another 15 years. You have David in Psalm 51, and there's a tragic side to that too, because he repents and he talks about God accepting a broken spirit and a contrite heart, not looking for sacrifices, and we see that God does forgive him in the sense that there's still a continued relationship there with David. There's still a continuation of the promises that God had given to David, and yet David's son through Bathsheba still dies, right? So there's consequences, and those aren't always avoided just because there's forgiveness. But there is a very real sense of forgiveness and continuation of the relationship, because God is the one who desires to do that. We were talking a little bit about some of the applications of that, with maybe how we can take that mindset with God and then apply it to people and maybe kind of mess up how we deal with human relationships. So Spencer, I wanted to just give you a moment to talk about that, because you have a counseling background. So you understand forgiveness in very awkward situations in ways that a lot of people don't.
Yeah, it's very awkward and very delicate. I've worked with couples who have experienced infidelity. I've worked with individuals who have had abuse perpetuated on them, and a whole bunch of other wide variety of time opportunities for forgiveness. And it's really delicate, because you have to be careful about when you, well, certainly me as a counselor, I can't push people to forgive, certainly not before they're ready. Like, there's all kinds of value system imposition that goes on in there. But it's also a little bit re-traumatizing to be like, okay, now you need to forgive this person. It has to be a process, and it's very nebulous. It's a lot like grief. Like, I always tell my clients with grief, like, you have to let the process go. Like, it has to go through its own at its own speed in its own way. And forgiveness is very, very similar. So I think about the only thing that I've found as like a common thread with that is that idea of like, I'm not going to hold it against them. It happened and I feel it. My body still carries evidence of it, whether it be by scars or just like, my body twitches and reacts every time I, have that particular trigger, engage. So, it's not gone. Like, the sin that was perpetrated is not, it happened. And I have a daily reminder that it happened. So it's not behind me and I'm not past it. But at the same time, I'm also not going to hold it against you. I'm not going to demand retribution. I'm not going to demand that specific pound of flesh back, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And so again, it goes back to that restorative versus retributive justice. Like, the whole idea of forgiveness is saying, I am refusing retributive justice. And I feel like that process that a lot of my clients have kind of worked their way to and through when they've been through horrific situations is really reflective of what's in the biblical narrative, is that when God says, I forgive, he's doing so as the only one who is ideally and righteously positioned to be able to know when restorative justice can say enough and when it says more. And that's something only he knows. And so I just want to make sure we leave space when we talk about God forgiving, that yes, it definitely does mean sometimes a payment and sometimes not. And that's his call, not ours.
Yeah. Well, and the other side of that is, with God, generally speaking, when he's forgiving, what he's doing is he's saying, I'm here to continue this relationship. Right. Mm-hmm. God can do that because he's God. Like, no one can abuse God, right?
Right.
To bring that over into the kind of situations you're talking about and say, well, therefore, what needs to happen for you to forgive your abuser is for you to continue the relationship, is a totally terrible way
right.
of trying to apply this thing, because you're not God. You can be abused.
And because abuse is all about imbalance of power and control. And that doesn't exist when it comes to God.
I mean, it does, but it's the other way around.
It's the other way around.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Man, so I guess maybe some closing thoughts. I know Phil is actually on his lunch break, so we maybe
Yeah, I'll
Phil,
have to
you want to
head off soon.
you want to give closing thoughts first, Phil?
Yeah, I guess I'm still processing, but it, it's helpful for me, like I said before, to think about God wanting or accepting a life, not a death. And Jesus does that. And then to think about what that means for the way I live my life as a living sacrifice in community, because living sacrifice is written to the Jews and the Gentiles who are now being forced to live together, and they are one living sacrifice. How do I live? What does my life look like that would make it acceptable? And then what are ways that I can offer offerings to God that I can learn from Leviticus? So what are acceptable offerings that I can offer to God? But then thinking about forgiveness, the wrong that has happened to me or to someone else is still there. Like you can still bear the hurt of being wronged, or the destruction from a sickness or a cancer or whatever it is. And someone can be forgiven for that, but there's still damage. And I think that's where I've been thinking about atonement as filling in the gap.
That's really beautiful.
Oh,
Right. And there's so many different metaphors about it, but when I
So you're breaking up pretty bad. I don't know if there's a connectivity thing.
The family that invited us into the relation father that he's in to share.
oh man.
Oh.
Yeah.
I wonder if his battery was just like done.
Yeah, it's over.
Yeah.
Whoa.
I'm gonna just open this. Oh, there he is.
All right, am I
There you go.
back?
Yeah.
There we go.
Is that better?
Yeah.
I was saying
yes.
some really profound things. You guys
Yeah.
missed it all.
Yes, we did. We did.
You were talking about the kind of sacrifices you can bring, and learning that from Leviticus, and learning that from Scripture, and bringing valuable things and that kind of thing. And then you kind of had cut out and in and out. So what was next?
Okay, I was just thinking about the mixed metaphors of atonement and blood and forgiveness. But where it becomes real for me in thinking about atonement, filling in the cracks or making things whole again. And then when I drink the cup in communion or the Lord's Supper, whatever Jesus has done, his life that has become acceptable to God, and he's invited us into that, to share that relationship that he has with his Father. But when I drink the cup, I imagine that my life, the cracks have been filled in. So his lifeblood is, all the holes and the stuff that has degraded in my life, that his blood is filling that in. And we know that it's acceptable. We know that his life is acceptable to the Father, and that is becoming part of me. And that's essentially who I am.
And that's exactly what's happening in Leviticus.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
That's what Paul
Yahweh
calls out
God
as well.
dwelling in the midst of the people and sharing communion, fellowship, food, and life with them, and giving that back to them so that they can then be shaped and transformed into his image bearers, the ones who carry his name out into the world. And that's how he's going to restore and redeem all of creation.
Do you think that's where Paul is using, or it says our lives are hidden in Christ.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, and I think about that, in terms of how we think about communion, Eucharist, Lord's Supper, like what is happening there, right? Part of that is us partaking of Christ, and part of that is us becoming the body of Christ more and more together.
Mm.
It's not just an individual thing, but it's a corporate thing of him knitting us together more and more. So that community aspect is there, and that's part of why Paul was so mad when they weren't acting that out well and not discerning the body. But then I think what we see is that sense of God has provided us the raw materials. We then make the bread and the wine. We bring that as a gift to God, as a Thanksgiving gift, Eucharistia, literally in Greek,
Yeah.
meaning giving thanks. And then as we offer that up, God does something to transform that, to make that actual like food for us in a spiritual sense. However you understand that happening, we don't need to have that argument. But like, it is spiritual food for us, and it helps to transform us, and it helps to then bring us to the place where we are now part of the body of Christ. And if we think about the body of Christ in communion, the body of Christ is offered for those that are present. The blood is poured out for those that are present, that we become part of the offering that God then is giving for the life of the world. And so it's in our self-sacrifice, in interacting with other people, that they can see the love of God in what Jesus did, in what we're doing, as we're kind of living that same pattern in our lives. And so that just is kind of, for me, brings that kind of full circle. It's like, wow, like what kind of application of life is that?
Goodness.
Mm. Mm.
That's awesome.
Life is swallowed up in death.
Yes.
That's the theme. That's the biggest. Or sorry, the
Other way
death
around.
is swallowed up in life.
There we go. I was like, yes, but then there's more.
The upside down.
Yeah. Well, and that's the, the thing of like, why did Jesus have to die? Right. I think the clearest answer that we give is he had to die because conquering death kind of requires dying first. And Hebrews 2 talks about that very specifically, that he is the one who, took the power of the one who held the power of death, the devil, right? And he did that in his death, and he did that in his resurrection. And you have that, the victory there alongside the cleansing and the intercession and all of the other things that Jesus is doing in his life, offering his life to God as a perfect ascension offering. I actually kind of think the use of ascension with the ascension and with it kind of makes sense to me. It's like he is the sweet aroma, like his entire life being lifted to the Father. And then all of that, like there's that sense of, when we think about, are these sacrifices, still needing to be done, or are they fulfilled? It's like, oh, they're fulfilled, man, like filled to the full, because he accomplished everything that they were meant to do. In a sense that is beyond what even they were capable of.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to log out, guys, so
All
I've
right.
got to head off.
Thank you very much, Phil.
All right,
All
thanks a
Good
lot,
to
Phil.
chat. Thanks, guys.
Any closing thoughts from you guys?
Yeah, this is it's been really stretching for me to reinvestigate Leviticus, reinvestigate my understanding of atonement. And it's been a long process. So it's not just been, I saw this video a couple of weeks ago, or listened to the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and then was just like, oh, everything needs to change. And it's only been 2 weeks. It's been a whole lot more. And the discussions in the last week have been really, really stretching, that have culminated in this discussion. So, I like threading themes from beginning to end. And if I have a tendency of putting things on the back burner if I can't see the threads, the color of the thread we're talking about in Leviticus or the Exodus or wherever we're at in the Bible, if I can't see that thread somewhere else. And so when we're talking about it being a meal, and then the idea that, the things that Phil brought up about how in the the pagans' understanding of the flood narrative, where I don't remember the name of the Noah character, offers the sacrifice, and then the gods show up like flies, and how this is different, and that God is actually the one initiating the relationship and initiating the meal. And then all of that being culminated in what we celebrate as the Passover or Pesach or the Eucharist, and seeing a new light being shed on what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5 near the end of it. And I never understood why his thoughts went this way, talking about, now we have been given this ministry of reconciliation, beseeching on God's behalf, be reconciled to God, because he who knew no sin became sin on our behalf, that we might become the righteousness of God. This makes a whole lot more sense now when you're looking at the gift nature of sacrifice, when you're looking at the sharing of a meal nature of sacrifice, when you're looking at this from a more holistic, across the board view, and seeing that it's not focused on the death, but that death is necessary to get to life, to get to the meal, to get to all the other gifts that come along with that death. Just seems to be a much more healthy and beautiful way of looking at it. And it's not as confusing to me as going back and forth between, the death is necessary, or it's not necessary if someone's willing to stand in the gap. It just seemed like back and forth there. So anyways.
Awesome.
I think for me, just like a last thought would just be the things that we believe matter, or at least they should matter. And I mean, like, the whole reason why I got into Leviticus and why I started really diving deep is because my daughter was going to be born, and I just started to realize, I'm like, okay, I know a lot of things that I've been handed down to me, and I've always kind of skipped Leviticus when you do the whole reading plans and stuff like that. And I just don't know what's in there.
It's
and I
leg
don't
day.
know what I believe. And I mean, not that I was questioning any of that. I just couldn't articulate it. I couldn't understand how and why or anything like that. And so I started actually reading the text. And ironically, that's what kind of broke me, I guess, upended things, is actually going back to the text and reading it. And so but again, the whole reason why was just because I want to pass that on to my daughter, and I want to make sure that she doesn't walk out of her life going, man, my dad gave me some really messed up ideas about God. And I think that's really what drives me when I have these kind of discussions here and online and whatever. It's just to say that I want to make sure that everybody can be able to clearly articulate who they think God is, and then match that up with what the text actually says God is, and see if they actually line up or not, and then live like that.
And that's, I mean, you want to talk about this whole trend of deconstructing. It's people literally doing that, but without having enough of a through line or an alternative frame or narrative to hang the things that they still think are valuable on, to be able to hold on to the faith. And they deconstruct because they have these ideas of God that they can see some of them are not healthy, but they don't know what to do with it. So they walk away. So yeah, having kids, man, it's definitely a motivator for me too.
It wrecks you.
Me too.
In a lot of ways, and a lot of ways for good.
Yeah. And I think it helps us understand God more. When we realize, okay, I know a little tiny bit of what it's like to be a father, and then we think of all of what it means to call God Father and go, wow, and I think that's why that frame of restorative justice is always the overarching one when we talk about things. And when God is executing his wrath and his judgment and things, it's where things have gone so far that there is no recovery, that they're impeding the restorative work that he's doing. And so this thing, this people, this, this king, whoever it is, this needs to stop. That's where the retributive justice actually occurs. And then God continues his restorative work, because that's the focus, because God is Father.
Yes.
So that
Yeah.
And he
is
loves
huge.
to give good gifts.
Yes.
And he loves to
Yes.
receive them too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess I would just encourage people, after this, because we're going to be sharing in different places, go back and listen to the episodes with the Bible Project, especially that first one. I might recommend doing them in reverse order and doing the second one, the one on sacrifice first, because I think you'll see some of the resonance with what we're saying, filled in with a little more color and detail. Yeah, go ahead.
The only clarification, we keep saying set first and second. It's
Yeah, sorry.
actually the second and the third.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, just so you know.
Oh,
Yeah, because like the first one is
You're
how
right.
God reveals himself in Leviticus, which
Yes.
is really good on its own terms, because it talks a lot about God's accommodating nature and how he's kind of working within the system.
Yes.
And then the second episode is the one on atonement.
Right.
And then the third episode, we're talking about in the Leviticus scroll series.
Mhm.
The third episode is like about, it's titled like something like "What are burnt offerings for?" But it's like
Mhm.
it goes through all the major offerings. So
Okay. Yeah, I think I was thinking the first and second one's dealing with sacrifice and atonement, but yeah, you're totally right. So don't want to be confusing there. Yeah, go back and listen. Hit us up. We're in a lot of discussion groups you guys are into, especially in the Tim Mackey one, and would love to hear thoughts, challenges, whatever, how this maybe helps, all of that. Knowing that we're not here to throw any shade.
Mm.
We're very appreciative of the Bible Project and Tim Mackey and John Collins and all and everything they do. But just trying to kind of further the conversation even more, and maybe broaden it out a little bit. So
Yeah.
thank you guys for hopping on here. This is awesome.
absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.